Napoleon Bonaparte went from ruling huge parts of Europe to dying alone on a tiny island in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. And what's interesting is that it didn't happen because he suddenly became stupid. It didn't happen because his soldiers stopped fighting. And it didn't even happen because Europe magically became stronger overnight. A lot of it traces back to one decision: invading Russia in 1812. Which sounds obvious now because history already spoiled the ending for us, but at the time, this wasn't seen as a suicidal move. In fact, if you were living in Europe in the early 1800s, there was a decent chance you would have assumed Napoleon was about to win again, because that's what he always did, and that's what makes the story fascinating. The disaster in Russia wasn't some random accident, it was the result of years of success slowly convincing one man that the rules no longer applied to him. So first, we need to understand how Napoleon became Napoleon, because people throw around phrases like military genius constantly, but they usually skip the part where Europe spent over a decade genuinely terrified of this guy. Napoleon Bonaparte was born in 1769 on the island of Prussia, which had only recently become French territory. And even though history remembers him as this larger-than-life French ruler, he actually grew up feeling somewhat disconnected from mainland France. He spoke French with a Corsican accent, his family wasn't particularly wealthy, and when he attended military school in France, a lot of the wealthier students looked down on him. But one thing became obvious pretty quickly: he was unusually intelligent, especially when it came to mathematics and military theory, which is part of why he ended up specializing in artillery. So artillery probably sounds boring compared to cavalry charges in giant battles, but in Napoleon's era, artillery was becoming revolutionary. Cannons were no longer just heavy weapons you parked somewhere in the background. The best commanders were starting to realize artillery could completely shape the outcome of battles if used aggressively and precisely. And Napoleon understood this earlier than most. He studied range, terrain elevation, timing, mobility, supply routes, movement speed, details that many aristocratic commanders treated as secondary concerns. A lot of Europe generals at the time came from noble families where status mattered more than technical expertise. Napoleon came from the opposite direction. He treated warfare almost like an engineering problem. And once the French Revolution began in 1789, France entered a period of complete chaos. The monarchy collapsed. Political factions turned on each other constantly. Executions became common during the Reign of Terror. Governments rose and fell in rapid succession. And in the middle of all that instability, military promotions suddenly started happening faster because many aristocrat officers either fled the country or were removed, which created opportunities for ambitious young officers like Napoleon. One of the first moments that really put him on the map happened during the siege of Toulon in 1793. Royalist forces inside the city had allied with the British, and France desperately needed to retake the port. Napoleon, still a relatively unknown artillery officer at the time, proposed positioning cannons in locations that would force the British fleet to withdraw. And it worked. The city fell. Suddenly, this young Corsican officer wasn't just another soldier anymore. People in power started noticing him. And that became a recurring pattern throughout his life. Napoleon would show up somewhere chaotic, make an aggressive decision other people hesitated to make, and somehow it would work. Then came the Italian campaign in 1796, and honestly, this is where Napoleon starts looking almost unreal. The French army in Italy was in terrible condition before he took command. Soldiers were underfed, supplies were inconsistent. Some troops reportedly marched without proper boots. Morale was awful. On paper, this was not the kind of army you'd expect to dominate experienced Austrian forces, but Napoleon moved faster than the commanders fighting him expected. That became one of his defining traits. European warfare at the time involved slow, methodical maneuvering. Napoleon hated waiting. Instead of fighting enemy coalitions as one united force, he repeatedly moved quickly enough to isolate smaller groups and defeat them individually before reinforcements arrived. At battles like Montenat, Lodi, and Arcole, he aggressively attacked, sometimes taking risks that would have looked reckless if he failed. But they kept succeeding. And every victory built his reputation further. French newspapers started portraying him almost like a heroic figure from mythology. His soldiers became fiercely loyal to him because he shared hardships with them and constantly emphasized glory, achievement, and national pride. He also understood propaganda extremely well. That's something people sometimes overlook. Napoleon wasn't just good at war, he was good at controlling his image. He wrote bulletins praising victories, exaggerating successes, and shaping public perception carefully. Long before modern public relations existed, Napoleon understood the importance of narrative, and eventually France started seeing him less as a general and more as the future. Then came Egypt in 1798. Now this campaign is complicated because militarily it's both impressive and disastrous at the same time. Napoleon defeated Egyptian Mamluk forces decisively at the Battle of the Pyramids. French formations and artillery devastated cavalry charges that looked intimidating but couldn't break disciplined infantry squares. But strategically, the campaign suffered a massive blow when the British Royal Navy, commanded by Horatio Nelson, destroyed much of the French fleet at the Battle of the Nile. And this matters because it exposed one of Napoleon's biggest weaknesses. Britain controlled the sea. On land, Napoleon could outmaneuver almost anyone. At sea, Britain had the advantage, and that imbalance would shape almost everything that came later. Eventually, Napoleon returned to France, where the government was still unstable and unpopular. People were exhausted by years of revolution, violence, and political instability, and Napoleon recognized an opportunity. In 1799, he participated in the coup of 18 Brumaire, overthrowing the existing government and establishing himself as first consul, which sounds temporary and modest. It wasn't. He was effectively in charge. Then, in 1804, he crowned himself Emperor of the French, and the symbolism of that moment was incredible. Traditionally, a pope crowns an emperor. Napoleon took the crown himself and placed it on his own head. It was basically his way of saying, I didn't inherit power, I earned it. And Europe watched this former artillery officer become one of the most powerful men alive. Then the victories started piling up even faster. In 1805 came the Battle of Austerlitz, often considered Napoleon's masterpiece. And to understand why historians obsess over this battle, you have to understand the situation. Napoleon was facing the combined armies of Austria and Russia. On paper, the Allied forces were larger, but Napoleon intentionally made his own army appear weaker than it actually was. He even abandoned advantageous high ground to bait the Allies into attacking what looked like a vulnerable position. The Allies took the bait, and once they committed their forces, Napoleon launched a devastating counterattack directly through the weakened center of their lines. The result was catastrophic for the coalition army. Thousands were killed, captured, or routed. The victory was so overwhelming that it forced Austria out of the war entirely, and after Austerlitz, Napoleon's reputation exploded. European rulers weren't just worried about France anymore, they were worried about Napoleon specifically, because this no longer looked like ordinary military success, it looked like dominance. And then came Prussia. Now Prussia had one of the most respected militaries in Europe. Its army carried the legacy of Frederick the Great, and many Prussian commanders genuinely believed they could stop Napoleon. Instead, in 1806, Napoleon crushed Prussian forces at the battles of Jena and Auerstedt so thoroughly that the rest of Europe was stunned. Entire armies collapsed with shocking speed. French troops marched into Berlin, and suddenly it looked like Napoleon could dismantle major European powers almost whenever he wanted. By the early 1800s, Europe was starting to revolve around him. France directly controlled huge territories. Other nations became satellite states, allies, or reluctant partners. Kings lost thrones. Borders changed constantly. Napoleon even placed members of his own family into positions of power across Europe. His brother Joseph became King of Spain. Another brother became King of Holland. This wasn't just military conquest anymore. It was empire building. And when somebody succeeds that consistently for that long, it changes the way they think. Failure starts feeling theoretical. You stop expecting the world to resist you successfully. And that mindset becomes incredibly dangerous. Because despite all his victories, one country remained a constant problem: Britain. And the frustrating thing for Napoleon was that Britain wasn't necessarily unbeatable on land. The issue was naval power. The British Royal Navy dominated the oceans. After the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, where Admiral Nelson decisively defeated the combined French and Spanish fleets, Napoleon basically lost any realistic chance of invading Britain directly. And Trafalgar was devastating strategically, because it meant Britain could continue trading globally while France struggled to challenge British maritime dominance. So Napoleon changed tactics. If he couldn't destroy Britain militarily, he tried destroying it economically. This led to the Continental system, and on paper, the idea actually made sense. Britain depended heavily on trade. Its economy relied on importing resources and exporting manufactured goods across Europe and beyond. So Napoleon attempted to cut Britain off from Europe markets entirely. He pressured or forced European nations under French influence to stop trading with Britain. No British goods, no British ships, no economic cooperation. The hope was that Britain's economy would collapse under pressure. But there was a major problem. Europe also depended on British trade, and enforcing an economic blockade across an entire continent is unbelievably difficult. Smuggling exploded almost immediately. Merchants found ways around restrictions. Illegal trade routes developed constantly, and some governments enforced the rules far less enthusiastically than Napoleon wanted. One of the biggest issues became Russia. At first, Russia cooperated with the Continental system after Napoleon and Alexander I of Russia temporarily improved relations following the treaties of Tilsit in 1807. And for a while, it looked like the two empires might coexist peacefully. But economically, the Continental system hurt Russia badly. Russian nobles depended heavily on exporting products like timber, hemp, tar, grain, and raw materials. Blocking trade with Britain damaged profits significantly. Meanwhile, British goods were still highly desirable across Europe. So over time, Russia started drifting away from Napoleon's system. Eventually, Alexander I reopened trade with Britain. And from Napoleon's perspective, this was more than an economic issue. It was a challenge to his authority, because empires like his depend heavily on perception. If Russia could openly ignore Napoleon without consequences, other countries might follow. And suddenly, the image of Napoleon as the uncontested ruler of Europe starts cracking. So in 1812, Napoleon decides to invade Russia. And again, modern hindsight makes this sound obviously ridiculous, but at the time, many people expected him to win, because he had spent years defeating coalition after coalition. Austria lost, Prussia lost, various alliances collapsed again and again and again. Why would Russia be different? Napoleon himself expected a relatively quick campaign, move in fast, force a decisive battle, capture key territory, negotiate peace, go home. That was the assumption. The problem was that Russia had absolutely no intention of fighting the kind of war Napoleon wanted. Napoleon assembled the Grand Army, one of the largest military forces Europe had ever seen, roughly 600,000 soldiers, and not just French troops. The army included soldiers from across Napoleon's empire and allied states, Poles, Germans, Italians, Dutch, Swiss, Croats, and many others. Different languages, different cultures, different levels of loyalty, and just organizing an army this size was a staggering logistical challenge. Think about food alone. Hundreds of thousands of men, tens of thousands of horses, every single day. An army this large consumed enormous quantities of bread, meat, grain, and water constantly. And unlike modern armies, Napoleonic forces couldn't rely on trucks, refrigeration, railroads, or rapid communication. Supply systems were slow and fragile. Armies often depended on gathering food locally while moving, which becomes catastrophic once the Russians start removing or destroying everything useful. The invasion officially began in June 1812. At first, things seemed manageable. Napoleon advanced deeper into Russian territory, expecting the Russians to eventually stand and fight. But instead, Russian commanders kept retreating. And this frustrated Napoleon enormously because his style of warfare relied heavily on decisive engagements. He wanted one giant battle that would break Russian resistance. Instead, the Russians traded land for time. And while retreating, they used scorched earth tactics. Fields burned, villages abandoned, supplies destroyed. Anything the French army could potentially use was removed or ruined. The further Napoleon advanced, the harder survival became, and conditions deteriorated faster than many people realized. Long before winter arrived, the invasion was already becoming a disaster. Disease spread rapidly, heat exhausted soldiers during summer marches, food shortages intensified, desertion increased, and horses died constantly from exhaustion, starvation, and overwork, which was catastrophic because horses carried artillery, supplies, wagons, equipment. Basically, the entire mobility of the army depended on them. As horses died, transportation collapsed. Wagons were abandoned. Cannons became harder to move. supply systems weakened further, and still Napoleon kept advancing, because he remained convinced that one decisive victory would solve everything. Eventually, in September 1812, the French and Russian armies clashed at the Battle of Borodino, and Borodino was horrific. This wasn't a clean, elegant Napoleonic victory, it was slaughter. Massive artillery bombardments tore apart formations. Repeated assaults turned parts of the battlefield into chaos. Casualties were staggering. Some estimates place combined losses at over 70,000 men in a single day. That's difficult to even imagine. Entire areas became covered in bodies, shattered equipment, dead horses, smoke, and mud. The French technically forced the Russians to retreat, but strategically, the result was disappointing for Napoleon, because the Russian army survived, and survival was enough. Napoleon needed a decisive collapse. Instead, he got a bloody battlefield and an enemy still capable of continuing the war. Then came Moscow, and this was supposed to be the payoff. Capturing a major city usually signaled the end of a campaign. Napoleon expected political pressure to force Alexander I into negotiations. Instead, when French forces entered Moscow, they found much of it abandoned. No dramatic surrender, no officials offering peace terms, no triumphant conclusion. Then fires erupted across the city. To this day, historians debate exactly how the fires started and how deliberate they were, but the result was devastating. Huge portions of Moscow burned, and suddenly Napoleon found himself sitting deep inside enemy territory in a ruined city with shrinking supplies and no clear victory. He waited. Days passed, then weeks, still no surrender. Alexander refused to negotiate, and meanwhile temperatures kept dropping. Then winter hit. And yes, the Russian winter absolutely mattered. But the important thing to understand is this: winter didn't create the disaster. It exposed and amplified a disaster already happening. The Grand Army was exhausted, undersupplied, starving, and overstretched before the worst cold arrived. Winter just pushed the situation beyond recovery. Temperatures plunged far below freezing. Soldiers lacked adequate winter clothing. Food became nearly impossible to secure consistently. Frostbite spread. Men froze during marches. Some collapsed and never got back up. Weapons malfunctioned in extreme cold. Horses died in huge numbers, and every mile of retreat became harder than the last. Eventually, Napoleon realized remaining in Moscow was pointless, so the retreat began. And the retreat was arguably worse than the invasion itself, because now the army had to travel back through territory already stripped bare. Russian forces constantly harassed them with attacks and ambushes. Not always huge cinematic battles, sometimes just relentless pressure designed to wear exhausted soldiers down further. And every day, more people died. Cold, starvation, disease, exhaustion, violence, everything combined together. One of the worst moments came at the Berezina River in November 1812. French forces desperately attempted to cross while Russian armies closed in around them. Temporary bridges were constructed under terrible conditions while freezing soldiers, civilians, camp followers, and wounded men crowded the riverbanks trying to escape. Chaos erupted. Thousands died. Some drowned in freezing water. Others were crushed in panics near the bridges. Some froze where they stood. By this stage, the campaign no longer resembled an organized invasion. It resembled collapse. And by the time the remnants of the Grand Army escaped Russia, the damage was catastrophic. Exact numbers vary between historians, but the scale of the loss was undeniable. One of the most powerful armies Europe had ever seen had effectively been destroyed, and the psychological impact across Europe was enormous, because for years Napoleon had seemed invincible. Now people realized something incredibly important. He could lose. And once that idea existed, everything started changing. Prussia turned against him. Austria became less reliable. Coalitions reformed. Enemies became bolder. And Napoleon suddenly found himself fighting wars against opponents who no longer feared him the same way. That shift mattered enormously. Empires often depend as much on perception as raw military power. And the Russia campaign shattered the perception of invincibility that Napoleon had spent years building. Eventually, after further defeats, Napoleon was forced to abdicate in 1814. He was exiled to the island of Elba. And somehow, even after everything, he still came back. In 1815, he escaped exile and returned to France in what became known as the 100 Days. Troops sent to arrest him instead joined him, which honestly sounds fictional. For a brief moment, it looked like Napoleon might somehow rebuild his empire again. Then came Waterloo. And after Waterloo, it was over. This time, Britain and its allies made sure there would be no second comeback. Napoleon was exiled again, this time to St. Helena, a remote island in the South Atlantic Ocean, thousands of miles away from Europe. And there, the man who once dominated Europe spent the final years of his life under British supervision. And honestly, that's what makes this whole story so fascinating. Napoleon didn't fail because he suddenly became incompetent. The traits that made him extraordinary, confidence, aggression, willingness to take risks, belief in his own judgment, also pushed him towards catastrophe. For years, bold decisions had worked, so he kept making bigger ones, until eventually he made one that reality refused to cooperate with, and history changed because of it. So yeah, if there's one lesson history seems determined to repeat over and over again, it's this. Invading Russia sounds like a great idea, right up until it isn't.